Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Tehami and these are the headlines. Kabul says the legitimacy of the war must be discussed with the Taliban before any progress can be made in the Afghan peace talks. In an interview, the Afghan government's negotiator, Abdul Hafiz Mansour, said the talks will not have an outcome until the issue is clarified. 3 meetings have been held between both the sides since the talks resumed in Doha on 6th of January. Russia has dismissed demands by some Western countries to release opposition leader Alexei Navalny. In a briefing, a Kremlin spokesperson said Navalny's case is purely a domestic matter and Russia won't allow anyone to interfere in it. He was arrested on Sunday after returning to Moscow for the first time since he was poisoned last year. As US President Donald Trump enters his final full day in office, President-elect Joe Biden has moved to dismiss a new White House decree on travel bans. In one of his last orders, Trump had tried to end travel bans for visitors from much of Europe and Brazil. But Biden's spokeswoman said now is not the right time to ease travel restrictions. The number of coronavirus infections in the US has crossed 24 million as its death toll nears 400,000. Pakistan has approved the Chinese Sinovac vaccine against COVID-19 for emergency use. The country has registered 1,800 new cases and 58 fatalities with a death toll crossing 11,000. Globally, the virus has claimed 2.03 million lives and infected over 95.5 million people so far. 2 more Australian Open players have tested positive for COVID-19, bringing the number of infections to 7. This has stirred a controversy over the event starting next month in Melbourne. Over 70 players and officials have been placed into quarantine after passengers on 3 charter flights returned positive tests for coronavirus. Those were the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Kabul says the legitimacy of the war must be discussed with the Taliban before any progress can be made in the Afghan peace talks. In an interview, the Afghan government's negotiator, Abdul Hafiz Mansour, said that talks will not have an outcome until the issue is clarified. 3 meetings have been held between both the sides since the talks resumed in Doha on 6th of January. But complete working groups from both the sides have not met for the last 6 days. While the meeting scheduled for Monday was also cancelled. The Taliban last confirmed a meeting of the 2 negotiating teams on January the 9th. At least 4 soldiers and 15 Taliban fighters have been killed during clashes in Afghanistan's northern Kunduz province. The defense ministry said the clashes took place after the Taliban attacked a security outpost in Dasht-e-Archi district. It said 12 other Taliban fighters were also wounded in the fighting. The ministry added that the Taliban's attacks were pushed back by security forces. Meanwhile, the Taliban claimed to have neutralized 18 soldiers during the raid and overrun the outpost. As US President Donald Trump enters his final full day in office, President-elect Joe Biden has moved to dismiss a new White House decree on travel bans. In one of his last orders, Trump had tried to end travel bans for visitors from much of Europe and Brazil. The decree is to come into effect on January the 26th, but the Biden spokeswoman said now is not the right time to ease travel restrictions. She said Biden plans to strengthen measures around international travel in order to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. Security is intense in Washington as Joe Biden is set to take office on Wednesday. Thousands of troops have been deployed in the wake of the January 6 riots at the Capitol building that left 5 people dead. The FBI has earlier warned of possible protests across the nation by right-wing extremists emboldened by the invasion. US President Donald Trump has restricted the purchase of drones from what he calls adversary countries. The White House said the adversary countries include Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. It said unmanned aircraft systems from these countries threaten US national and economic security. Trump signed an executive order which also directed a deeper assessment of the security risks from Chinese-made drones. It also instructed US agencies to prioritize removing Chinese drones from American government fleets. The move follows Washington's blacklisting of Chinese drone maker DJI and dozens of other companies. Germany says it regrets US plans to impose sanctions on a Russian pipe-laying ship. The vessel Fortuna is involved in the construction of Moscow-led Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. The German economy ministry said Washington had informed Berlin of its plans to impose these sanctions. It added Berlin was taking note of the announcement with regret. Talking to the media, a German government spokesman said Berlin's view on the gas pipeline remains unchanged. Russia has dismissed demands by some Western countries to release opposition leader Alexei Navalny. In a briefing, a Kremlin spokesperson says Navalny's case is purely a domestic affair and Russia won't allow anyone to interfere in it. He said Navalny's calls for mass protests against his detention are troubling. Navalny was arrested on Sunday as he returned to Moscow for the first time since he was poisoned last year. He was jailed for 30 days for allegedly violating the terms of a suspected sentence he was given in 2014 on fraud charges. Navalny says the charges are politically motivated. In India, the 10th round of talks between the government and farmer unions have been postponed to January 20. Farmers have been protesting outside the Indian capital against the government's controversial farm laws since 26th of November. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court appointed committee is scheduled to hold its first meeting today to resolve the impasse. In Punjab, Chief Minister Amrinder Singh has slammed the investigation agency's harassment, saying it will not weaken farmers' resolve. On Monday, women farmers observed a day-long fast and burned the effigy of the IMF, which has backed the laws. The number of coronavirus infections in the US has crossed 24 million as its death toll nears 400,000. Globally, the virus has claimed 2.03 million lives and infected over 95.5 million people so far. More in this report.
As rising deaths and infections crush hopes of an early end to the pandemic, the WHO has warned the world that weekly deaths from the virus may surge up to 100,000 soon. In the U.S., healthcare workers have declined to take vaccines, creating difficulties for pandemic response by sending wrong message to the public. President-elect Joe Biden announced to keep the travel restrictions for much of Europe and Brazil hours after President Donald Trump lifted the ban. Meanwhile, Brazil has kicked off a nationwide COVID-19 immunization program by distributing China's Sinovac biotech vaccines following emergency use authorization.
Today is another important day for all of us. After many meetings, requests, collections, Brazil has made it. Brazil managed to start its vaccination with this event, which is symbolic, of course, but real, and the practical that initiates the vaccination rollout.
Over in Europe, France's new infections have hit a 6.5-week high, while the number of COVID-19 hospitalizations also rose to highest in a month. Portugal's fragile health system is under growing pressure due to the worst surge in cases and deaths since the pandemic started last year. In the UK, our research has revealed nearly a third of COVID patients discharged from hospitals in England were readmitted within 5 months. But the country is focused on mass inoculation as it gears up for a 24-hour vaccine rollout in London's hospitals.
As you well know, we are prepared to go 24/7. There are movements in supply and making sure that we get the supply into people's arms as fast as possible is absolutely critical. So I wouldn't read too much into an individual day's data. I think the best thing to do is look at the weekly averages, and as you say, you can see that going up and up fast.
In Asia, China reported more than 100 new cases for a 7th straight day in worst domestic outbreak since March last year. Japan has detected the 3 cases of the UK variant of coronavirus in people who had no history of travel to the country.
Pakistan has approved the COVID-19 vaccine manufactured by Chinese state-owned firm Sinopharm. Earlier, Islamabad permitted the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine for emergency use. The country's death toll has topped 11,000 as it recorded another 58 fatalities and 1,800 cases overnight. The health ministry says currently there are over 35,000 active COVID-19 cases in the country. The ministry adds out of over 523,000 countrywide cases, more than 476,000 people have recovered. It says over 236,000 cases have been detected in the Sindh province. Punjab has reported nearly 150,000 cases so far. Iran has started another round of military exercises in the Gulf of Oman amid tensions with the U.S. It comes a day before U.S. President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration. The state media said the drill will involve rapid reaction units, airborne units, and mobile and offense brigades. Meanwhile, speaking at a conference to decide measures to avenge General Qasem Soleimani, Iran's foreign minister said Iran doesn't seek tensions or war with the U.S. Jawad Zarif said the measures taken by the lame government in the U.S. has no effect on the will of Iranian people. Iran and the U.S. have increased their military activities in the Middle East. Syria has denied recent reports about meetings between Syrian and Israeli officials as lies. In a statement, the Syrian Foreign Ministry said Damascus is clear about its stance towards the Palestinian issue. It said Damascus will not compromise on the liberation of Israeli-occupied Golan Heights in accordance with the international resolutions. The ministry said the party is advertising such false news aimed to undermine the Syrian stance towards the Israeli occupation. Earlier reports emerged claiming that Israeli and Syrian officials met under Russian mediation in the Russian base of Hmeimim in Syria. Palestine has called on European Union to send observers to monitor the state's elections scheduled for later this year. Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh asked the EU to send international observers, mainly in the election process in Israeli-annexed East Jerusalem. Shtayyeh said Palestine will also ask Israel to allow Palestinians in Jerusalem to participate freely in the elections. President Mahmoud Abbas announced first Palestinian polls in 15 years with legislative elections for May 22nd and presidential polls on July the 31st. Meanwhile, EU welcomed the election call and urged Israel to facilitate the electoral process throughout the Palestinian territory. Iraq's cabinet has postponed general elections to the 10th of October to give more time to election authorities for arrangements. The polls were scheduled for June. This comes as the country has been grappling with the mass demonstrations against the government. Early elections were a key demand of the demonstrators. Since October 2019, hundreds were killed by security forces and gunmen with suspected links to militia groups. In Sudan's South Darfur state, the death toll from ethnic clashes between armed militias has risen to 55. This comes just a day after another deadly episode of violence in West Darfur state killed 83. A militia leader said at least 37 others were wounded, while several homes were torched during the attacks. He said the Rizigat militia carried out the attack to avenge the killing of one of its members by the rival non-Arab Falata militia. Rival militias in Sudan signed a peace agreement with Khartoum in October last year to end the hostilities. Following the pact, UN African Union peacekeeping mission ended their patrols in the area. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Welcome back. Uganda has accused the US of trying to subvert the last week's presidential election held in the country. This came after a US diplomatic mission to Uganda said the house arrest of Kampala's opposition leader Bobi Wine is a worrying sign. In a statement, the mission said the last week's vote was tainted by harassment of opposition candidates and a nationwide internet shutdown. It said the unlawful actions and the house arrest of a presidential candidate is a worrying trend for Uganda's democracy. Earlier, Uganda's army blocked the US ambassador Natalie Brown from visiting Wine, who went on to check to the opposition leader's health and safety. Japan has accused South Korea of worsening the already strained bilateral ties by reigniting the clash over World War reparations. Speaking in the Japanese parliament, Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi called Seoul's demand of compensation over wartime sex slavery illegal. He termed the recent South Korean court ruling seeking compensation an abnormal development. Motegi urged Seoul to correct international law violation and restore healthy relations. Earlier, Seoul's Central District Court ruled that Tokyo must give $91,360 to each of the 12 victims. The relations between Seoul and Tokyo have plunged to their lowest in decades over the issue. Seven UN member countries have lost their right to vote in the General Assembly because of unpaid dues. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made the announcement in a letter to the President of the General Assembly. The countries include Iran, Niger, Libya, Congo, Brazzaville, South Sudan, Zimbabwe, and Central African Republic. The letter also mentions the amount each country can pay to recover their right to vote. The UN Charter calls for a voting rights suspension if the contribution to the body is delayed by 2 years. Tens of thousands of people continue to flee Indonesia's South Kalimantan province after 10 days of torrential rainfall. At least 15 people have been killed in floods that affected over 10 cities of the province. The National Disaster Mitigation Agency says over 39,000 people have been evacuated so far. Indonesia's President Joko Widodo has termed it the worst flooding in half a century. The country's Met agency has warned of the risk of extreme weather and other flood dangers in the coming weeks. In Italy, long streams of red-hot lava flowed down Mount Etna as Europe's tallest and most active volcano erupted again. At 3,330 meters, Etna is the continent's most active volcano and can burst into action several times in a year. Mount Etna often erupts but rarely causes damage. It's believed to have the longest written record of eruptions than any other volcano. British billionaire Richard Branson's Virgin Orbit has reached space for the first time with a successful test of its air-launched rocket. The rocket has delivered 10 NASA satellites to orbit, achieving a key milestone.
Virgin Orbit's Launcher 1 rocket was dropped mid-air from a modified Boeing 747, nicknamed Cosmic Girl. The rocket demonstrated its first successful trek to space some 35,000 feet over the Pacific. The company says 2 hours after its Cosmic Girl carrier craft took off, the rocket successfully placed 10 tiny satellites in orbit. The space test has also pushed Virgin Orbit into an increasingly competitive commercial space race alongside rivals including Rocket Lab and Firefly Aerospace.
In the northwest region of Syria, heavy downpour, freezing cold and increased spread of COVID-19 have exacerbated an already dire humanitarian situation of displaced Syrians. The people in the need of humanitarian assistance are unable to maintain the disinfection and sanitation measures. Details in this report.
In Idlib, more than 100 refugee camps are the house of around 4 million internally displaced Syrians. The heavy rains in the area have added more misery to the already poor living conditions of the Syrian refugees. Under wet canvas tents, these displaced Syrians face another threat of the pandemic. A Paris-based organization, Doctors Without Borders, says the risk of COVID-19 transmission is high at the camps due to overcrowded tents and lack of basic health services.
A heater does not protect us from cold weather. Just like every year, winter is winter and it is hard. Every time it rains over us. This year, we will have the coronavirus pandemic and 5 cases were reported and tents cannot be used for quarantine.
The lack of clean water and sanitation has also made it difficult to maintain disinfection and sanitation measures. But as countries around the world begin nationwide vaccination campaigns, some Syrians worry they will not have similar access.
We have been suffering for 10 years from displacement. We move from one place to another, from one village to another, from one town to another. All countries are busy with the coronavirus pandemic.
A local organization has been building cement rooms around the camp that can serve as better quarantine facilities.
Textile tents fail to offer the most basic levels of privacy, protection, and isolation when facing the dangers of the coronavirus. That is why we have built in the current year more than 1,000 cement rooms as part of our program to face COVID-19.
Syria has been ravaged by a civil war since early 2011 when the Bashar al-Assad regime cracked down on pro-democracy protesters. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and millions more displaced so far.
In Israel, blockaded Gaza, a man with unswerving determination takes up to fight with his disabilities through karate. Despite the odds and non-availability of proper facilities, Yusuf Abu Amira has learned the skill to fight with the sticks. More about his bravery in this report.
Yusuf Abu Amira, a Palestinian law school graduate, never let his disabilities hold him back. Born without legs and with only partially developed arms, he has taken up a new challenge, karate. The 24-year-old orange belt shows his stick fighting skills as he trains with his coach at Gaza's Al-Mashtal Club for martial arts.
As people with disability, or what we are referred to as people from a marginalized category, I want to play karate so I can defend myself, and I dream of taking part in international championships and the Olympics.
His mastery of the stick helps him make up for his missing limbs. He has also learned how to deliver strong punches and fend off attacks with his body and arms. Coach Hassan Al-Rai says his pupils showed particular determination.
I was surprised that Yusuf has different skills and can do things better than people with fewer disabilities could do. He is determined and defiant, and he challenges his reality. He wants to show society that he is not disabled. Society is disabling him by putting barriers in front of him so that he cannot reach his dream.
A resident of Gaza's beach refugee camp, Abu Amira, travels along city street in a motorized mobility scooter. He graduated from the Islamic University of Gaza's College of Sharia and Law last year.
More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned. The International Monetary Fund says the global economic outlook is extremely uncertain after the new strands and consecutive waves of COVID-19. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said the fund needs more resources to help heavily indebted countries. Speaking at a virtual news conference, Georgieva said the IMF rapidly increased concessional financing to developing economies, but she said further steps were needed. Georgieva added it was important for the global lender to expand its capacity to support countries that have fallen behind. Meanwhile, the new chair of IMF Steering Committee, Magdalena Anderson, said the need for liquidity remained great. Anderson said she would consult with the member countries on options for expanding liquidity. Wall Street stocks have jumped after upbeat earnings from big US banks and a possible big stimulus. Shares of Goldman Sachs surged nearly 3% in pre-market trading after the bank topped expectations for the fourth quarter profit and revenue. Some tech shares also rebounded from their last week's losses. Nasdaq Composite traded 1% higher, while S&P 500 and Dow Jones Industrial Average also gained over 1% higher. Meanwhile, oil prices climbed as investors look to higher demand. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus News.